speaking. So I'll do the first part and Nico Gavaris will do the second part. So we all have PowerPoints for you, so things will work out well. Okay, let's say the opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasurer of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So we're continuing on our sort of journey, fulfilling the Great Commission. And this week, the topic really is the establishment of national churches. All right, national churches, that's going to be something we're going to follow for a great deal of the time, at least for the next few weeks, as we see that develop throughout the world. So next week, of course, we'll do it the Cyrilo-Methodian method, comes from St. Cyril Methodius, the brothers from Thessaloniki, who kind of pioneer, so distinctly the Orthodox approach to missions, which is first worked on the Slavs, or given to the Slavs in Moravia, and then moves forward. But they kind of crystallized the process, but of course it's already beginning before that. So, I think it's rather interesting when I talk about this spread of Christianity in the national churches. I'm dealing with a slew of the national churches that we're not in communion with, all right? Because these are the Oriental Orthodox churches, all right? Sometimes called the non-Chalcedonians. And the story is, of course, that they accept the first three ecumenical councils, the first two of the creeds created, the second one of Ephesus that deals with the term Theotokos, but they do not accept Chalcedon. All right. So their emphasis is that, when we're very clear that after the incarnation, Christ is two natures, fully human and fully divine, they sort of emphasize the formula of St. Cyril of Alexandria, and which says one nature, the word incarnate. However, we make it clear that when Cyril said that, he was very clear that the two natures did exist. But so we end up with a number of these churches which are separated, and I end on the positive note of the Georgian Orthodox Church, which of course is in our family of Chalcedonian Orthodox churches, or sort of the Byzantine sort of churches. It's one of the ancient national churches, although its story is filled with ups and downs and occupations and suppression, but revival. So very interesting. So let me move to my PowerPoint and we will take it from there. Okay, so here we have fulfilling the Great Commission, mission to Egypt, Armenia, Ethiopia, India, the Syriac tradition, and Georgia. So those are the basic areas that we're talking about, which makes sense because when we discuss sort of the command of Christ that it was a systematic mission, Jerusalem, then the province of Judea, then Samaria, the neighboring region, and then to the world. So other than India, of course, these are kind of much closer to the origins. And all of them claim some connection with the apostles, although sometimes it would be stretched a great deal, but don't use my words and give them to someone like a Georgian. They'd be very upset with me. All right, but we look at these nations, many of them are around the Mediterranean, of course, Georgia being on the Black Sea, India at a greater distance. All right, so here we go. So here's the first one. So we can talk about the Egypt and the Coptic Church. And so as the Coptic Church is very interesting, a church which really has suffered. It's been under persecution even in the modern era. When you look at the figures as far as Coptic Orthodox Christians that exist in Egypt, the Egyptian government downplays the numbers because Egypt is primarily, of course, an Islamic state, but we know there are at least 15 million Coptic Orthodox Christians, and it's an indigenous tradition. So sometimes if you talk to the Copts, they'll tell you that, oh yes, it's true that we're the original Egyptians because we accepted the message of Christ. Those who are Islamic came in the 7th century. We were here before. And one of the ways, normally they don't drink. but the Egyptians one day a year put a sort of a drop of wine on their hand and lap it up, proving that they're not Muslims, they're Christians. All right, but a very interesting tradition. So I've used a sort of a Coptic icon here of the Theotokos, you know, and you can see kind of the coloration of the skin, a little bit more darker Mediterranean, a little more stylized in an Oriental sense than one of our icons, but still icons. So the Coptic Church likes to emphasize the verse from Isaiah. Isaiah 19:19, in that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the land of Egypt. Okay, so this is, you know, they'll say that it was clearly stated in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, we indeed would be a nation that would accept Christ and his altar would be raised in Egypt. All right, so when you talk about mission activities, one of the things that we would say is missionaries deal with what's there, all right? And they sort of will look at what's in the culture, which in the philosophy, which is in the mindset, and they'll look at that and use that as maybe a kernel that will allow them to launch Christianity. And of course, when we talk about Egypt, one of the main stories is that of Osiris, Seth, and Isis. So do you know that story? It's sibling rivalry to the max. So the good brother is Osiris, the bad brother is Seth, the wife is Isis. These are the Egyptian pantheon of gods. And Seth chops his brother up into 14 pieces, all right, and scatters them. And the good wife, Isis, finds the pieces and binds them back together, sort of in the sort of mummy wrappings that you'd find in Egypt. And by reuniting them and binding them together, guess what happens? Comes back to life. So what the sort of when Christian missionaries reach Egypt, they would say, look in your culture. There's a foreshadowing to the notion of the death and resurrection of Christ in the story of Isis, Seth, and of course Osiris, who's raised from the dead. The shadow is there. The fulfillment is in the death and resurrection of Christ. All right, so very important. One of the other things that the Church of Egypt would emphasize is, of course, that after the nativity of Christ, what happens to the Holy Family? Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, what happens to them?
They go there.
Now they have to get out quickly because what is Herod planning to do to all the children of that age? Kill them. So where do they go? They go to Egypt. And so there are various sort of shrines and monasteries in Egypt. The Coptic tradition has a number of ancient monasteries, and many of them are associated with the flight of the Holy Family to Egypt. And then, of course, the notion that God calls Christ out of Egypt, where he returns once the coast is clear, lives with his parents in Nazareth, and then launches on his public ministry. So Egypt stresses these connections of foreshadowing the Hebrew scriptures, foreshadowing within the sort of Coptic tradition, the Egyptian tradition, and then the Holy Family present in Egypt for a number of years. So their apostolic link is going to be Mark the Evangelist. So when we even talk about the Coptic Church, they emphasize the Patriarchate of Mark the Evangelist. So the notion is there, he preached in that community. Of course, it becomes kind of an interesting mixture because you have very important schools of Greek learning there. You have a Coptic common tradition. You have a Jewish community there that is responsible for the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into the Septuagint translation. So you have many things coming together in Egypt. But what does Coptic mean? Coptic is the vernacular. It was the language that was spoken. So if you talk about the Rosetta Stone, so what's the Rosetta Stone? Okay. You saw it. You saw it. If you've been to London and you've been to the British Museum, you have seen the Rosetta Stone, which is about this high, right? And it's kind of wide, a little bit wider than me. Sometimes that's surprising, but it's sometimes wider than me. And you have the same text in the hieroglyphs, in the sort of Greek, and the Demotic, which is the Coptic. And it's the key that then gives us the ability to translate the hieroglyphs into a language that we understand.
Is the Coptic similar to the Greek? It's heavily
Aramaic.
Heavily influenced by it. No, Aramaic takes us back into sort of Palestine, the Syriac tradition. So this is separate and distinct. It's Coptic, but the basic alphabet used by the Coptic language is Greek, of course.
Well, it is heavily influenced by Greek, but it is distinct enough not to be a dialect.
That's right.
Where did they steal the Rosetta Stone from?
Oh, well, that was the story that I was going to go back to. So the Rosetta Stone,
Because they stole it.
yes, they did. And the British stole it from the French, who stole it from a building. So, one of my examples always is in Athens, you have the cathedral that was built sort of after Greek independence. And then next to it, you have the little cathedral. But I love the building material used in the little cathedral. It has recycled stones from a Zoroastrian temple, and it's just very interesting. Well, in this case, the Rosetta Stone was in a sort of a building that came from the Pharaonic period, but it was kind of harvested as building material, and it was used in a fortress in Alexandria Harbor during the 17th century. And when the French arrived, when the French conquered that area under the Emperor Napoleon, they were greeted in many ways, but Napoleon went to Egypt with a team of archaeologists. So they surveyed, they did drawings, and they saw that. So the French chiseled it out of the fortress, and as they were preparing to ship it back to Paris, the British intercepted the ship, and they took it to London. And hence it's in London, and it was in the news today because the Egyptian government asked for the return of the Rosetta Stone and other artifacts, like the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon friezes. I wouldn't hold my breath. But anyway, so it was in the news today. I'm amazed. But with Coptic, we have a fragment from the Gospel of St. John from before the year 150. So it shows a native tradition is emerging. Yeah.
Just a little detail. Why is it called Rosetta? Is that a place?
I suspect it was probably the name of the place it was found. I suspect. So don't footnote me, but I suspect. All right. So that a portion of the Gospel of St. John was found in the Coptic language, and it can be dated to 150. More fragments already to the year 200. So what you're doing is you're kind of doing the process of evangelization and using a culture. So
John made it there?
No, John didn't, but his text was translated into Coptic for the common people to understand. So, and that goes with our approach. We talk about we incarnate the Christian faith in the areas. So you're using the legend of Osiris, Seth, and Isis. So you're using that as kind of something, a jumping off point to present the understanding. And you're also using the language of the people and translating the scriptures into it. Of course, it went on beyond that within the Coptic Church because there's an extensive sort of theological library, scriptural library, and their liturgy is in Coptic.
When did the Greeks show up there? Because like Cleopatra.
The Greeks were there too. The Greeks were there from the Alexandrian period. She descends from Ptolemy, who was one of the 4 generals of Alexander the Great. As the Ptolemaic dynasty rules, she's the last pharaoh.
Alexander was like 300 BC.
Yes. Yeah, around that time, yeah. So you have a Greek presence there for all those years. Yes, and we know that what the record says that Cleopatra cried at the burning of the Library of Alexandria. So many of the ancient texts were lost, and most of those ancient texts were in what language? Greek, yes. All right, so we're having sort of a Christianity encounters the tradition that exists in Egypt and incarnates it. So of course it deals with the Greek community that's there, and it's going to deal with sort of the more common sort of Coptic tradition too. All right, so when you fast forward, so this is the cathedral in Alexandria for the Coptic Patriarchate. All right, and we have approximately 15,000 people, 15 million people who would be claimed to be members in Egypt. But of course, we have several Coptic churches here in Chicago. There's a Coptic diaspora throughout the world. I think there are two parishes of the Coptic church here. The one major one is, big surprise, it's labeled St. Mark's. It's near Hinsdale, but there are other parishes too.
Yeah, I went to a Coptic church and the priest wore a mitre during his
Yes,
service.
yes. More a Western mitre during the services.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll notice something about this. So you're not seeing crosses too prominently. So you know that churches were also said to be they're kind of sunken. So they're not meant to be tall standing buildings where a Christian presence noted. And that becomes something which is traditional in sort of Egypt. So we're talking about even during the Ottoman period, and still now there are persecutions. So there was a fire in one of the Coptic churches in suburban Cairo recently. And part of the reason was the congregation couldn't get the permits to update the wiring. It led to a major fire. So there's kind of subtle ways of persecution and limitation that continue, but the church survives and continues. So the current patriarch is Tawadros II, and he's been patriarch for 10 years. So we see that, he's a priest 1990, so 32 years ago, bishop 97, and he succeeded Shenouda III. So I remember Shenouda III. Okay, so I had 2 encounters with Coptic bishops even before I was ordained. So the first one was in St. Mark's Church, as it was called, in Cleveland, all right? And in that case, the priest was, what was his name? Father Mikhail E. Mikhail, all right? Okay, all right. But his visitor was the Coptic bishop who was in charge of theological education and charity. He was killed with Anwar Sadat when he was assassinated by someone from the Muslim Brotherhood. So, when I saw that, I knew him. All right. And then Patriarch Shenouda. So Patriarch Shenouda made a visit to the United States. And I was in a flight from Chicago to New York. And I said, there's Pope Shenouda. Oh my God, and I made enough noise that the stewardess said, would you like to sit next to him in first class for the flight? So I did, and he was just very nice and very kind. But you had to have a souvenir. They were big on souvenirs. So the souvenirs looked like large medals or coins of Pope Shenouda. And some of the deacons had them attached to their stoles and everything. But I actually met him. So he was very interesting. He had a PhD in chemistry or one of the sciences, but was steeped in the Coptic monastic tradition and then elected the primate. He was very much instrumental in reviving the church, and that's continued under the present sort of Patriarch Tawadros. But they are in the non-Chalcedonian family, so they're classified as Oriental Orthodox. They're one of the major churches in the Oriental Orthodox churches. So out of that also comes their 2 daughter churches, the Ethiopian Church and more recently the Eritrean Church. Yes.
You brought up Sadat. What was the status of the church?
It was better than under Mubarak.
Under Mubarak, yeah.
Yeah.
He was a moderate.
Yeah,
in the church.
He was moderate, and it was a better position than under Gamal Abdel Nasser, his predecessor.
I'm going to ask you about Nasser
Yeah.
too. So he's better than Nasser.
Yeah. The church had a better sort of, I would say, a better sort of life under Anwar Sadat. And part of it was because he was so much under attack from the Muslim Brotherhood that had been in existence for about a century and still is in existence in Egypt. So since he was friendly and they were on a reviewing stand together, that's why they both were assassinated simultaneously. Yeah. Okay. So the daughter churches are the Ethiopian Church and the Eritrean Church. So of course, when we talk about the Eritrean, I have to talk about Haile Selassie, but we'll wait till we get through the first slide. Although it's very difficult for me not to talk about Haile Selassie, whom I wrote to in high school. So unusual things. Okay, so when we talk about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I like to talk about that with African Americans who assume that the only type of Christianity that exists for African Americans is evangelical or Pentecostal. I'm going, yes, but there has been indigenous Christianity in Africa for centuries, and it can trace it back at least till the 3rd century, and with some activity before that. And they're all very shocked when they see that. Then, you know, I talk about the Rastafarians. So Rastafarians believe that Rastafari Makonnen was an incarnation of God. Rastafari Makonnen was the name of Haile Selassie before he was crowned the emperor. But we'll talk about that shortly. All right, so, you know, no big surprise here. The Ethiopian church claims that their original Christianization came through the Ethiopian eunuch. So, you know, what I found was an Ethiopian icon of the baptism of the Ethiopian.
Father, we can't see we can't see the icons. We can't see your screen.
I moved it, so I don't know what to do here. Oh, I haven't shared it. So let's go down here. So what do we do here? Yeah. So did they see any of these? Probably not.
No.
I hate that when it does that. Well, there we go. Okay, so there we go. And we'll back up and just let you see.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll let you see. So this is when I was talking about the Coptic church. There it is. So there's the text for the slide, and there's the Coptic icon of the Virgin Mary. All right. So the text I basically described. So here we have the modern Coptic Orthodox Cathedral in Alexandria. All right. And now we'll go to Ethiopia and we can actually see it. So you can see the slide now?
Yes. Yes.
Hello, Steve. Steve has joined us. All right. So there you have the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch by Philip the Apostle. All right. There's water. All right. And here's the quote. Now the angel of the Lord said to Philip, go south to the road, the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he started out. On the way, he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasure, the Kandak, which means Queen of Ethiopia. This man had been going to Jerusalem to worship. So he's part of that sort of Ethiopian community which has encountered Judaism. All right, the descendants of that will be the Falasha Jews that still exist. Many of them were airlifted to Ethiopia, in the 1970s, 1980s. But we dealt with that last week, the conversion of the Ethiopian who is reading the scroll of Isaiah. And Luke kind of is placed there by the Lord, explains it, and he asked to be baptized. No, Philip, I mean. Philip. So Philip explains it, and then the eunuch looks to Philip and says, what prevents me from being baptized? Well, of course, there was a major problem if he had to become Jewish first, because he was castrated. All right. So in other words, he couldn't be circumcised, and he's immediately baptized. So what the Ethiopians would say and make their claim is that when this Ethiopian eunuch returned to Ethiopia, he began the evangelization of his people.
I know his name.
We don't know his name. He's just called the Ethiopian eunuch, at least in scripture. All right. So that's very important. And then the Ethiopians claim that two of the apostles, Matthew and Bartholomew, actually went to Ethiopia. Now, I don't know if we can really prove that, but don't tell an Ethiopian what I said. They firmly believe that Matthew and Bartholomew were there. And there's also a reference in St. John Chrysostom to the apostle preacher, Peter, preaching to the Ethiopians in Jerusalem. So that's an important reference, which will link them to that country. So they claim the foundation from the Ethiopian eunuch and three apostles, right? So Matthew, Bartholomew, and Peter.
So the Ethiopian Jews are before the Christians, or?
Yeah. There was an Ethiopian Jewish community called the Falasha Jews, all right, that have been present. Many of them were airlifted. because during the struggles in Ethiopia between the Eritreans and the Ethiopians and the time of the Marxist dictatorship, they were airlifted to Israel.
But going back to right after Jesus, were there already Jews? in
Yes,
Ethiopia?
there were Jews in Ethiopia already. Yeah, that goes back earlier.
Isn't that part of their church?
Their church has much more. Well, the Sabbath for them, of course, is the Sabbath, but they celebrate primarily the Lord's Day, but with a heavy emphasis on the Saturday too.
Well, there was a heavy Jewish influence, and many of them claimed to be descendants from the Queen of Sheba
Yeah.
and Solomon.
Right, as the dynasty did. So Haile Selassie would loudly claim that he was from the Ptolemaic dynasty, and he was the result of the meeting of the Queen of Sheba and Solomon.
And also there's what this fails with the legend, they claim also that it was according to the legend that the Ark of the Covenant.
And we'll show the church in the next slide. So we have that, yes. Okay.
He was the Lion of Judah.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about him, the conquering Lion of Judah. All right. So there's the claim of this apostolic missionary activity, but most of the credit goes to Archbishop Frumentius. Frumentius, obviously a Greek, some Syriac connections, but a Greek, begins the actual systematic preaching in the kingdom of Aksum. And Aksum is ancient Ethiopia and some of the lands that were even farther east of there. But Aksum becomes a Christian kingdom, and it's primarily through the activity of Frumentius. Frumentius converts the emperor of Aksum, Ezana. 330. So we're talking about something which, you have these individual examples, but then what you have here is the systematic expansion of Christianity into Ethiopia in 330. So we're dealing with basically 1700 years ago. There's been an existing, indigenous African tradition of Christianity. All right. And of course, the main liturgical language is Ge'ez, but the spoken language is Amharic. It's not Aramaic, it's Amharic. But there's a combination of like liturgical language, Ge'ez, preaching and teaching in Amharic. Okay.
They still use Amharic now.
Yes, that's the spoken language. All right. So the church I'm showing there is St. Mary of Zion. And the understanding is that within that church, there's the Ark of the Covenant, which is guarded by a priest who is assigned to that church, and no one can enter it. So the Ethiopians firmly believe that the Ark of the Covenant is there. All right. And you'll see that in every Ethiopian church, there's like a box, which is a copy of the Ark of the Covenant, which means they're tracing themselves back to those Jewish roots too. Right. Very important. So this church is really under the authority, or was under the authority, of the Coptic Church. Once things were organized, it was under the Coptic Church, to the point where the highest rank that an Ethiopian clergyman could have would be an archimandrite. All right, so a monastic priest, but any bishops were sent directly from the Patriarchate in Alexandria, and that becomes sort of a difficult issue. So we'll get to that, but they're part of the Oriental Orthodox family of churches. In other words, they only accept the first three ecumenical councils, as does their mother church of Alexandria. Okay. And one of the things that are famous are the Lalibaba, are the churches that are carved into stone. So they're a place of pilgrimage. There's a number of monasteries associated with that. Yeah, they're kind of buried. You have to go down to get into them, and they're solid stone that are carved into churches. So that's something I've always wanted to see. But every time I contemplate going to Ethiopia, it's not very stable. There's a famine. Yes.
There's a war.
There's a war. Yeah. It doesn't work too well. I really wasn't able to do it during the reign of Haile Selassie that came to an end in 1974, and it's been difficult since then. All right. So one of the people that I mentioned here is Haile Selassie. and this movement to really sort of consolidate the church as an autocephalous church. All right, and we should know the term autocephaly. So autocephaly is self-headed. So the notion there is that when you look at Orthodox churches that can elect all of their diocesan bishops plus their presiding bishop are autocephalous. All right, so they can elect locally their presiding bishop. So, we have a family of autocephalous churches, and that means, of course, we're talking about, obviously, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Antioch. The Holy Synod of the Patriarch of Antioch is meeting today to discuss their life in the world and their American archdiocese. They're presided over by John the 10th. The Patriarch of Alexandria is now just about ready to go back to Alexandria. He's been in the United States. The Russian church has its own patriarch, self-headed. So the highest kind of status for an Orthodox church is autocephalous. Under it is autonomous. So an example of an autonomous church is going to be, for instance, Finland. Those of us who are in Finland, the Church of Finland is autonomous under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which means they can elect their diocesan bishops, but the Archbishop of Helsinki, Metropolitan Bishop, he's the primate of the church. He has to be elected by the mother church, which means in his case, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, Japan. So Japan is an autonomous church under the aegis of the Russian church. So they elect their own diocesan bishops, but the Archbishop of Tokyo is elected by the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox
As
Church.
the Ukrainian church.
Well, there are two groups.
Yeah, but
Two groups.
the Moscow group.
The Moscow group is autonomous, but there are problems with that autonomy. When they tried to assert the fullness of their autonomy, they were rapidly slapped on their hands about 4 months ago.
Partially autonomous?
No, they wanted to live up to what the decree was.
The
No.
Russians pulled back.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can have an autonomous church without it being a patriarch.
Yeah, absolutely. And a number of ours are. The Church of Greece is headed by an Archbishop of Athens,
The Church of Cyprus also as well.
Cyprus an Archbishop, Metropolitan of Warsaw, no Poland. Czech Church. Well, the Greek Archdiocese is neither autonomous nor autocephalous. It's an eparchy or a diocese of the Ecumenical Patriarchate.
That would explain St. Athanasius.
Yeah. Well, that's another situation. That's not under the archdiocese. That's directly under the Patriarchate through their diocese, which is centered in New York, which is basically a monastery and its dependencies. Okay, so Haile Selassie's name means power of the Trinity. So when he was consecrated, the emperor and crowned, his name was no longer Rastafari Makonnen. It becomes Haile Selassie, which means power of the Trinity. So, he built in the 1930s and 1940s the spectacular Church of the Holy Trinity in Addis Ababa. He kind of greased the way, I would say through many gifts, through persuasion. He convinced the sort of Patriarchate, the Coptic Church of Alexandria, that first they should have a local sort of archbishop who then becomes a patriarch in Ethiopia. And once you tap that person, you have the right to consecrate other Ethiopian bishops. So the Ethiopian church has been autonomous since about it's been autocephalous since about 1950, and its head was elevated to the title of patriarch in 1959. So one of the patriarchs was at St. Vladimir Seminary in New York and Princeton before I was at the seminary. So they said he was constantly looking for one good book because it made life easier than having to read multiple books to find the information needed. But at this point, they're quite well educated. All right, so you have the Patriarchate. Now it's Abuna Basilios is the Patriarch of Ethiopia. The capital, Addis Ababa, has the main sort of cathedral of the Holy Trinity. But there's an Ethiopian diaspora, so we have some Ethiopian parishes here. They bought one of the old sort of Russian parishes on the south side, and it's one of their churches.
I think it was Serbian.
No, it was OCA with the Semkov family. Yes.
First in commercial.
Yeah, right, yeah. But it was
What family?
they had several priests from the Semkov family. Well, they were not quite Russians in my book. They were more Carpatho-Russians.
Or what?
Carpatho-Russians. Okay, so, I have the figure for the size of the Ethiopian church is 50 million. We really don't know. So I was looking at numbers that led 38 million, 65 million, 50 million. But let's put it this way. It's a large church. Most people who call themselves Ethiopians are Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. Of course, there's a large Muslim presence there too. It's basically Sunni, but there's some Shiite activity too.
Haile Selassie was never a church official. Right?
No, he was the emperor.
He didn't have any authority inside the church. Like King Henry was.
No, not that way, but he had a great deal of influence as he funded most of it.
Okay.
He's buried now in that cathedral in Addis Ababa that he built, because we're not quite sure how he died after he was overthrown by the Marxist regime. But what ends up happening is that he was under house arrest, at least. He was literally buried under the presidential offices of Miriam Mengistu, the Marxist dictator, because he was certain that Haile Selassie would rise from the dead, and he wanted to shoot him if he did. So he outlasted, Mengistu was overthrown, and then Haile Selassie was exhumed and buried in the cathedral. So I remember sort of about 2 years ago, there was an article that I saw online from a newspaper in Washington. His great-grandson was married in an Ethiopian Orthodox church in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So the family continues, they're there.
They have
But
a party once a year in Washington Park.
well, that's the Ethiopian community, yeah. So, the Ethiopian church is kind of interesting. It does have a lot of Jewish elements to it, but it is part of the Oriental Orthodox family of churches, but definitely an indigenous church. Okay, and as we move on, we look at the Eritrean Church. So Eritrea was a territory that was during the imperial period of the 19th century, it became an Italian territory, all right? And, it had this traditional Eritrean Orthodox community under the Alexandrian Coptic Patriarchate. And it ended up sort of 1950, the areas were given to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia merged it into its structure. And when you have sort of a protracted struggle for independence, you also have an independent church created in Eritrea. So I remember one time when sub-zero weather, there were two exhibits one at the Art Institute and one at, I think at the Field Museum. And I ended up recruiting a cab. And the cab driver's father was an Eritrean priest. So he was very nice. He didn't want to charge me for the cab ride, but I was with Chris and Peggy Costas. We insisted on paying him. But, so we ran into the local Eritrean community. But the Eritrean church basically becomes independent at the same time Eritrea becomes independent. And there was a deal brokered with the Coptic Patriarch to grant them autocephaly. In 1993, the sort of Ethiopian church was not happy, but it recognized it in the following year. So it has been a difficult story because the Eritrean church has been persecuted at varying times by the governments in Eritrea. There's a diaspora. We're very good at splits, jurisdictional splits. The Eritrean church experienced that. There's been unity since really for the last about 5 or 6 years. You have Patriarch Quertos was elected in 2020, and the membership is over 3 million. All right, so another African indigenous church. And probably the sort of most famous and the largest of the non-Chalcedonian churches is the Armenian Church. All right. And the Armenian Church claims that it is the result of missionary work by apostles Bartholomew and Thaddeus in Edessa. So you have the legend of Abgar, the king that was blinded and was healed by the icon of Christ, not made by hands. They would claim that's the origin of their Christianity. Don't push it. All right. But the notion is that these various apostles baptized people, ordained clergy, most of whom were killed during the persecutions that the Armenian sort of political leaders sort of placed upon them. The conversion really comes with Gregory the Illuminator. That's an icon of Gregory the Illuminator, who is the one who he actually, comes into Armenia. And what he does is he converts the king who had been persecuting Christians. And by converting the sort of royal family, the king orders that the nation be evangelized. And what you end up having is by that period from 301 to 305, you have the Christianization of the nation, and the Armenians like to tell you that they are the first Christian nation. That's their boast. All right. Gregory became the first Patriarch Catholicos of the church. All right. So one of the things that he did was you have the ancient capital of Vargarshapat. All right. And it's transformed into Echmiadzin. All right. And Echmiadzin means descent of the only begotten. So it was a vision of Christ coming down over that spot. And so that becomes the center of the Armenian Church, the cathedral of the descent of the only begotten. That's where the church center has been ever since.
Gregory is the patron saint of the Armenian.
Gregory is the beloved patron saint. All right. And here you have the translator of the scriptures is Saint Mesrob. So you have a complete translation of the scriptures from Greek and Syriac in 411. All right. And not far after that, you have the rejection of the Council of Chalcedon, which means they are an Oriental Orthodox church.
Although there was a split within the Armenian Church as to the Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians. Whereas sometimes they would fervent the followers of the emperor and not the followers.
Right. Yeah. And it's a church that, I mentioned this in my class to one of my students was Muslim. I think she was rather surprised when I said, yes, the Armenians. And then I mentioned the persecution. So when we talk about the persecution of Holocaust in Turkey from 1950 to 1923, so you have about 1.5 million to 2 million Armenians, almost an equal number of Greeks, plus the Assyrian percentage was even higher, and those of the Syriac tradition too. And they basically were exterminated because they didn't fit the definition of Turk, which meant they were Christians, not Muslims. So it's the first major Holocaust of the 20th century, often overlooked. All right. But so that becomes a very important touch point. So in Yerevan, which is the political capital of Armenia, there's a major monument to the Holocaust. So usually when dignitaries visit, they stop there and they lay a wreath. But it's an independent national church worldwide. So one of the bishops I went to school with was Vaskan Asadurian, who becomes Bishop Avak, now Archbishop Avak of his hometown, Baghdad. So he had come to the United States and he was a doctoral candidate at Tulane University in New Orleans, then went to seminary, and he was one of our students who was in the St. Nurse's theological program, which was housed at St. Vladimir, so we knew him, but he ended up being the Archbishop for Iraq, for their church, and he must be pushing 80. All right, so about 9 million people, all right, and they have kind of a structure, which is they have 2 Catholicos patriarchs, they have patriarchs and archbishops. So the main patriarch, Supreme Patriarch Catholicos, is Karakin II, but then they have a separate sort of patriarchate in modern day Lebanon, Cilicia, that's Aram I. And there was a split between parishes. It kind of fits with the broader Orthodox notion of either Oriental or Eastern splits jurisdictionally. So you had some parishes under Etchmiadzin and others under Sicilicia. They now cooperate better, but that's about. They do.
And a Baptist church. And a
Oh,
Pentecostal
yes.
church. How'd they get split up so much? Were they targeted?
Well, most of the Protestant influence comes from territories like the Armenians in Lebanon and other places that are proselytized by Protestant missionaries. There was an effort sort of, in areas in the period 16th, 17th centuries to create uniat churches in community Catholic Church. This is one. Yeah, absolutely. All right, and another aspect of this is the Syriac tradition. So Syriac Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch. So originally it was clearly one with the Antiochian Church, and they would claim that their missionary activity is who? Paul and Barnabas. They would claim the first bishop is, of course, Peter as Bishop of Antioch before he moved on to Rome. And then you have even sort of, there's a connection of Syriac to Aramaic as far as language. So they would view themselves as.
Aramaic is actually in Syria.
Yes, that's the ancient form of the language. All right, so the liturgy they use is St. James, the brother of the Lord, in Syriac or Aramaic. All right, so, they were called a number of different names. It's in the Ottoman period they asserted the name Syriac rather than Arameans or Assyrians. This is the center of the theological activity that really begins the separation between Chalcedonian churches and non-Chalcedonian churches, because their prime theologians are Dioscorus and Severus. They're the leading Monophysite theologians. So through that, you have the rejection of the Council of Chalcedon.
Are they still in Antioch in Syria?
Oh, well, they've moved around because of the persecutions that they've experienced in that area of the world. So here we have sort of Jacob Bardaeus is the one that they, claim as the bishop that made sure that they had bishops. And of course, that Jacob Bardaeus was protected by the Empress Theodora in the palaces in Constantinople, whereas the Emperor Justinian supported the Orthodox party. She wanted to ensure their bets, and she protected the non-Chalcedonian leader, Jacob Bardaeus. So Jacob Bardaeus was a bishop, then went and laid hands and consecrated bishops throughout the entire sort of Eastern territories. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived as a church with orders. So he's responsible for that. So here we have another issue of the Unia. So 1660, with Western sort of activity, 75% of the members of this church become Uniats or in community with the Roman Catholic Church. So short around after that, they have a connection with the Mar Thoma Christians of India. So the Mar Thoma Christians we'll talk about next, but they were kind of converted, but really no real connections other than wandering groups. So the Syriac tradition has about 1,400,000. I think this is their Patriarch Catholicos. I tried to find the right picture. So it's Ephraim really, the second. All right. And coming out of that, we have the Malamkara Orthodox Syrian Church. So there's a parish, on the north side of the,
Norwood Park.
yeah, Norwood Park, yeah. Oh, yeah. So there are a couple.
They're all St. Thomas.
Yeah, they're all St. Thomas, right? So they claim that their founder is the Apostle Thomas, who went to India in 52. But really, there was no connection with the rest of the Christian world for centuries. So there would be wandering Assyrians. The Assyrian church was very active in the 6th, 7th centuries. So there even Marco Polo met some of them on the Silk Roads. But here's a case where they had connections with the Assyrian church. But the contact that becomes very important is going to be in the 17th century, and it really is with the Syriac church. So if they're connected with the Syriac church, it means they're going to be following its theology, which makes them Oriental Orthodox or non-Chalcedonian. So you have the ordination of what Bishop Mar Thoma I, a Syriac bishop, and that's what establishes their orders. They used Syriac for the most part for the liturgical service and scripture. The gospel was finally translated Malayalam, the sort of native language, in 1807.
Was that a dialect of?
One of the native Indian languages. All right. And this is, no, that's St. Thomas. Okay. And what they have is, I would say clearly they're a victim of colonialism. So first you have sort of the Portuguese efforts in these areas. The Portuguese missionaries try to make them Roman Catholics. During the British period, there was an effort sort of to really support Anglican and Protestant missionary activity here. So many of the people joined those churches. And then you end up having sort of a reconnection and autocephaly from the Syriac church. All right. So you have kind of a difficult situation that 1912, it's given its autocephaly. Then one group kind of tries to deal with strictly in India. The other one wants to maintain its connections with the Syriac church. It leads to a patriarch for one and a metropolitan for the other. And it's been united really since 1958 and clearly an Indian church. So there are about 1 million faithful. I've met a couple of their bishops and their people. So Mar Thoma, they're all Thomas. The third is the current patriarch, Catholicos, and that's him, I think. All right. But here's the one we deal with for the most part. Georgia, the Apostolic Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Georgia. And this is an example of one of their major churches in Mishketa. All right. So they're clearly part of our family of Orthodox churches. They claim Andrew. So very appropriately, we're saying that here at the Church of St. Andrew. I don't know. So anyway, but they claim connection with Andrew, and the original sort of conversion occurs there. So clearly, classical Georgian is the language of worship. Much of their singing is 3-part harmony, which sounds a little foreign to the ear initially. Byzantine liturgical service and structure, they're on the old calendar. So they're Julian calendar, so Christmas is January 7th for them. I've listed dates of autocephaly: 482, 506, 11th century, 1917, 1944, 1990. So when did they become independent? Well, there are sort of obviously dates in the 5th century, the 6th century. Most would say that, yes, there were examples of that, but clearly in the 11th century, in other words, the 1000s. But that was suppressed by the Russian church, all right?
The Russian church came first.
The Russian, not in this area. The Russians were conquerors and oppressors in this territory. So you have an autocephalous church, but Georgia is in a case where it's attacked by both Ottomans and Persians. And when the Georgians asked for help from the Russian Empire in 802, the Emperor Alexander decides the easy solution is to conquer and annex the territory. And what they did basically was they suppressed Georgian autocephaly. They tried to sort of change the architecture. Icons were whitewashed and replaced by 19th century Russian icons. They tried to sort of impose the Church Slavonic language liturgically. It was a disaster.
They're not Slavs.
No, they're not Slavs, not at all. No. They hate Russians.
And it's not an Orthodox architecture.
Well, it is for Georgians. It is. We're just used to one particular style as it's exemplified. This is another one.
Well, I mean, even the Georgians claim, St. Andrew.
Yeah.
So do the Russians.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians, and the Scottish, and the Greeks to a great extent. Yeah.
But there is a huge connection between the Armenians and the Georgians, especially when it comes to the church.
Right.
And probably, St. Nina, of course, is obviously the enlightenment of the Georgians, but St. Gregory the Illuminator had a large role to play in that area too.
Absolutely. And it's kind of interesting the way that the one ends up in the Chalcedonian family, the other non-Chalcedonian.
That's why some of the architecture reminds them of
Oh, yeah.
Armenian architecture too.
Absolutely.
Romanesque or something. I don't know how you describe it.
Well,
It's
very
an
close-
indigenous
very close to Armenian,
style. Yeah.
very close to Armenian,
Yeah.
But a lot lot of this, you have to remember that a lot of this was developed during the reign of Tamar the Great around the 12th, 11th, and 12th century.
Mhm.
Who, the great?
Tamar.
One of their kings.
Queen.
Queen, yeah, that's right, right. Tomorrow we would anglicize it too. All right, and sort of, you have their autocephaly was recovered in 1917 at the Russian Revolution. They did it. They proclaimed it. Their first patriarch was killed in their cathedral. He was later canonized. And you had 1944, the Russian church said, okay, you're autocephalous. And then 1990, the Ecumenical Patriarchate recognized their autocephaly. All right, but the current constitution says that the church is separate and independent, but it has a major role to play in the life of the nation. And the most trusted figure is the head of the church, the Catholicos Patriarch Elias II.
Who else has influence in Georgia? The Catholics, the Protestants, or anybody?
There was significantly a Jewish community, but that's
Yeah,
most of,
Jewish community.
yes, most of that's gone. There were very good relations with the Georgians and the Jews. In the south, in areas bordering Islamic countries, there's an Islamic presence. So not many Protestants, not many Roman Catholics, a few, but not many.
So even though they're so close together, the Georgians and Armenians are two separate.
Two separate, and their languages are not mutually intelligible. Here's the founder of the Georgian church, Nino Isoapostolos, equal to the apostles. So a female founder, and you'll see that cross she's holding. That cross was in a vision that she had of the Virgin Mary appearing to her, and it's like tree branches bound together by her hair. All right, and that becomes the symbol she uses. All right, so there's interesting. There's a Western story of her life, which says she's a Roman slave girl, but the one that's more traditional with the Orthodox Church said she was born in Cappadocia in a pious Greek-speaking family. And when you want to add ruffles and flourishes to the legend, they say that she's related to St. George. We won't go there. Also, on her mother's side, she's related to sort of the hierarchy or a patriarch in Jerusalem. So as a child, she was sent to Bethlehem and raised basically in a convent with the intervention of her relative. And she was sent to Rome. All right, he sent her to Rome. And while she is in Rome, she had a vision of the Theotokos. And this is what she was told by the Theotokos. Go to Iberia and tell the good tidings of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will find favor before the Lord. I will be your shield against both visible and invisible enemies. By the strength of this cross, the one she's holding, you will erect it in that land, the saving banner of my beloved Son and Lord. And the story is that she accepted that. She created the cross, and then she decided she would go to Georgia. She initially went to Armenia, where she spent some time in a convent, and then she went to Georgia.
There's no Georgian church around here.
Yeah, there's a Georgian parishes, which is heading towards St. John the Baptist, but there's a Georgian community. All right, and she arrived in Mishteka. Okay, I've been to Mishteka in 320, and once again, she deals with the queen named Nana. Nana was ill, seriously ill, and she meets Nino, and Nino prays that God will heal her. She's healed. The queen is baptized along with her whole staff. Her husband, Miriam III, is not happy and inaugurates a persecution of Christians in the area. And then on a hunting trip, he's struck with blindness. Who do they call? They called Nino. And once again, Saint Nino prays, and he can see again, and he's baptized, and he orders the evangelization of his people. So 325, key year. 325, he writes to the Emperor Constantine and Helen, the Byzantine emperor, and asks that bishops and priests be sent to convert his people. So there you have a connection with Constantinople.
No, the name Nino, though, shouldn't it be Nina?
No,
Italian?
but the Georgians won't like it if you say Nina. They use the form Nino.
For women.
Yeah.
Does it mean Antonina?
No, it means Nina. It's Nina in English, but it's Nino in Georgian.
It's a Greek name.
Yeah.
Nina in Greek too.
Yeah, right. So So what happens is that after the conversion, she retires to the convent of Bodbe. I've been there. That's where her tomb is. It's a center of pilgrimage. She was buried there where she dies in 338 or 340. And then you have kind of a monastic revival by 13 Syrian fathers, who deep in spirituality established monasteries. And the one major center of their activity is a hill, which is like the national burial ground for heroes. And you'll see this one too. Okay. And one of the people buried there is that woman. Okay. So, all right. So I mentioned the autocephalys in the Russians eliminated the autocephaly of the Georgian church and literally Russified it, from whitewashing icons to everything. All right. And they had a seminary in Tbilisi, which is now the National Museum. Right? And that was the place where Joseph Jukashvili Stalin studied. It was the first Marxist cell in Georgia. And part of the reason it was a Marxist cell is these are all Georgian young men, and they're kind of told that they will speak Russian. Worship will be in Church Slavonic, et cetera, and kind of as a resistance, they discovered Marxism. All right, so what you have is after the Russian Revolution, there's a re-declaration of autocephaly and a real struggle, but it kind of blossoms. And then when the Russian church was initially persecuted, it really wasn't hit too heavily. And this woman is one of the reasons. So she's Mama. She's Joseph Jukashvili Stalin's mother, Yekaterina, who was a pious Georgian Orthodox woman whose one sort of desire was that she'd save every cent so her son could be educated, become a priest. Well, Stalin didn't want to tangle with his mother. And basically, there wasn't a major persecution of the church in Georgia till her death in 1927. One of the parishes, it's a parish of St. George I served at one time. It was the parish of Lavrenti Beria's mother. So Beria was the KGB chief, but Mama stayed in Tbilisi. That was her church. So every time they threatened to close it down, Mama would show up at the secret police, and they wouldn't bother them anymore. So
Stalin's father was a priest.
No, Stalin's father was a drunken cobbler.
Stalin used to go to the seminary.
He did for about a year. Yeah, no, he was a drunk. So, but we're not quite sure. There may have been another person who actually was the father, but we don't know. But he wouldn't have been a priest. All right. So Ekaterina, Catherine, Jugashvili, and Lavrentia Beria's mother in some way protect the church. Strange things happen. But after Ekaterina's death in 1917, the persecution the Russian church experienced in 10 years was mercilessly hit on the Georgian church. It was devastated. I mean, you had churches closed. I mean, I remember one of the major churches in the Sioni Cathedral was used for all sorts of purposes, including a dance hall. And then they decided it was good acoustics, so they used it as a children's theater. But terrible things happened. And by 1970, you deal with 100 churches for a country of about 3.5 million. About the same number of priests and bishops, most of them being very elderly. No seminaries, nothing. All right. And the situation really begins to change with two different things. One is the election of Patriarch Ilya II. That's him, younger. He's 89 at this point, and he's been the Patriarch Catholicos since 1977. So he developed a friendship with Edvard Shevardnadze, who was the head of the Georgian Communist Party, who ended up becoming the foreign minister of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. And they worked out a deal that basically allowed the church to grow. And when there were demonstrations against the Soviet suppression of the church, against suppression of Georgian culture, Patriarch Catholicos Ilya joined some of those demonstrations. He became a protector of those who wanted to restore an independent Georgia, and he gained respect for the population. So when communism collapsed, the Georgian church was already set for growth. A seminary was opened. He had been a graduate of the Moscow Theological Seminary because there were none in Georgia. He led a seminary in the last years of the communist period, but gradually his importance comes to the fore when he's elected patriarch. So currently you have about 35 dioceses within Georgia, 38 bishops in Georgia, 730 priests, 600 plus churches, and monasteries that have revived, multiple theological schools. And of course, there's a diocese for North America. They have a monastery in Maryland. Of course, the monastery is St. Nino Monastery. All right. And there are parishes throughout the area, but more heavy presence in Europe, which isn't surprising. So it's really thriving. It's a very active church.
It's big in
So
Los Angeles or on the West Coast.
there are some in Los Angeles, there are Philadelphia, New York, Chicago's a smaller parish.
Barry,
There,
I mean, not to go back, but Barry was a monster.
yeah, he was.
He was a
But his
serial
m-
rapist.
His mother was a pious Orthodox
How
Christian.
do you explain this? Who explains?
I don't know if we can explain it. Mama
Yeah,
tried her
that's-
best.
10 times worse than Stalin. Right?
He was awful. Yeah.
His own people hated him. The KGB wanted him.
Absolutely. But, you know, the Georgian church has had a problem with, there are some sort of nationalities. For instance, Stalin actually wasn't a Georgian. He was a South Ossetian. And the South Ossetians are Orthodox Christians. North Ossetians are Muslims. So they're Abkhazians, the people who live to be, 100 years old? All right, that kind of story because
Maybe
they're,
yogurt or something.
yeah, that's right, the yogurt idea. But that area was,
I was kidding.
yeah, that's the story. But that area was one of the territories of Georgia occupied by Russia about 20 years ago. And they launched a Abkhazian church, which has a handful of parishes, but they have their own jurisdiction. So that's one of the issues. But, you know, the Georgian church is rather healthy. All right. And it's very much involved in the broader Orthodox world. So I've talked a great deal. I'm basically done with my presentation.
One of the things that's interesting here is there's nothing we touched upon where you can't find it in Chicago. It's all here. Everybody's here.
That's true. It's true. So what do you want to do? Do you want to start? And
Well, the problem is, mine's about 20 slides, so I have no way to go, it's 9 to 10 now.
so I would say what we would do is we'll do it next week because Nico's presentation is the origin of the Greek tradition within Orthodoxy. So he's on for next week. And then I move on to the Syro-Methodian tradition.
You're not talking tonight?
So any questions, any comments? Yes.
Who are the Palestinians? Are they Roman Catholics or they're some of them?
Well,
are?
Yeah, many of them are Orthodox. Originally, they would say they're all Orthodox Christians. So Father Nicholas Dakdal was one of my classmates at seminary. Currently he's assisting in our parish of Saints Constance and Helen. All right. He was at St. George, the Antiochian parish in Cicero for a number of years. But he's one who's, you know, the family looks back to 16 generations of Orthodox clergy in the family. So I think that in that case, you could say that it's a tradition which expands from the use of the Aramaic tradition into Arabic, but they have no sense of anything other than being Orthodox Christians. So you have a steady Orthodox presence there from the beginning, but there's a Melkite church, Byzantine Catholic church, which really has more Crusader connections and after. You have a Latin Patriarchate there, right? And
It's like the Patriarch of Antioch. We currently have 3 patriarchs of Antioch, but none of them reside in Antioch.
no, you can't live in, everyone's in Damascus now for the Antiochian Patriarchate. Even the Syriac moved, and they had to move out of territories because originally in the Ottoman territories, they had to move out of them during those years, 1915, 1917, when they lost everything. Finally, they ended up in Damascus in the 1930s. it's an interesting area. But for when I look at it, sort of, I'm somewhat familiar with the Georgian tradition because I've been there twice. And there's been a revival, even things like the medieval Georgians had a sort of a, what I'm trying to think of it, what's the glass that's enamel tradition. They had a tradition of enamels. Well, the Georgians have restored that. So I have a pectoral cross that was done in Tbilisi that's a kind of, Georgian enamel work, but that's been recovered.
So, and plus, regarding with the Georgian Church, I mentioned before, Tamar, the queen, she was the one that also had sponsored a huge work.
So you want to come up here and say that so they can hear you?
Sure.
So comments from the back, I don't think you hear too well, so I'm making Nico come up here and make his comments.
Thank you.
So no, I had mentioned before Tamar, the queen. So she plays a very important role inside the Georgian church and the Georgian national identity also as well. Because one of the things that she had done was, especially when she was, well, how can we put this kindly? When you had to deal with sort of aggression coming from the south, also with the Crusader states. So she had to balance between a military presence, and she realized that in order to have a proper development, probably the term is correct, you had to have a proper notion of a culture, and you had to have a proper notion of an identity itself too. So one of the things that she did was she sponsored the Viron Monastery in Mount Athos.
Mm-hmm.
It's named Viron because of Iberia, Georgia, the ancient name for Georgia. Now I think there's only one Georgian monk there. It's under Greek control. But one of the things that had become really important during that time is, first of all, she, along with the Diophysite Armenians, in other words, the Armenians had accepted the Fourth Ecumenical Council and all the ones afterwards, had basically created a type of learning center. They realized that they needed a learning center, and that's what basically Viron became. So you had a huge influence coming in from the Byzantine Empire to the Georgian state at that time.
Massive translation work done.
Exactly. And that did not only include the liturgical texts, it included historical texts, it included scientific texts, anything that you basically could imagine. So when you're dealing with Georgia, especially the church, I mean, the initial part, of course, is important, but Queen Tamar is basically one of the reasons why it stayed that way, or it stayed Orthodox.
Yeah, it's a very interesting tradition. The first time I was there, I served in the Kashveti Church, which is dedicated to St. George. So that's been a continual center of Christian worship for about 1,500 years. While I was there, there were two simultaneous liturgies, one in a basement chapel and one upstairs, and overflow outside. It was absolutely packed. There were about 12 to 15 priests that were involved in the two liturgies. It was massive. But the priest I met there was very interesting because he and his wife were both born in Tbilisi, but they had spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. as broadcasters for Radio Free Europe. And after the sort of collapse of communism, they went back to Tbilisi, and they became very close to Patriarch Catholicos Ilia. So they took me to the patriarchal residence. He said, oh, yes. Well, I wish he was here. Next time we'll schedule it better because he's at the home, which is it's on the Russian border. I was there this summer. All right. And there's a major church. He did that because he said that if I'm here, there's less threat of Russian troops coming. They'll respect me. All right. So that's the story with that. But one of the things we did is one of the modern Georgian saints is Elia Shavshavadzis. And Elia Shavshavadzis was a scholar. He was an attorney. He was, really a brilliant individual who campaigned for Georgian independence and the restoration of Georgian autocephaly. All right. And he was one of the major figures. He was at his home, which was about 15 miles outside of Tbilisi, and he was assassinated, hacked to death, all right, by someone who was primarily a supporter of Russian control in the area. All right. And what you ended up was when the trial occurred, his widow begged that in the name of my husband, this man not be executed. Well, they didn't listen. He was executed.
Targeted assassination.
Yes, it was a targeted assassination. And he was buried in that pantheon where Yekaterina Djugashvili is also buried, but it's Georgian heroes. And it's near the church where those 13 Syriac fathers preached and established a monastic church. So he's there. He was canonized eventually. All right. So he's a very important figure in the Georgian church, but also in world Orthodoxy. So I should have brought in that.
Recognize him too.
Oh, of course. Yeah. So we all recognize each other's saints, no matter what the
Well,
story
Russians
is.
killed them, I
Yeah.
mean, so.
I'll bring the icon in next week because I have a nice one.
Well, there's a couple of various stories. Because
Mhm.
around 1917 that this happened. And there is also
Before 1917, yeah.
Yeah, a little bit before. And there's also the question whether he was actually a Russian supporter or a socialist supporter in the country.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's.
He's their one of their major modern heroes, though. Yeah. So you end up with this restoration of a church, kind of simultaneously with the nation. And when communism collapses, they all kind of emerge. But Georgia had a difficult path after the fall of communism. There are civil wars. You have what? Shevardnadze looked really good, not too good. You have one of the last presidents is now. Yes, Saakashvili is now spending his, he was in Ukraine, he was in the Netherlands, he was in New York, and they told him not to come back to Tbilisi. So maybe,
He's in jail.
yes, he's in jail. His guaranteed sort of housing income is provided by the Georgian state. He's a prisoner. So the current president is a woman from the Parisian community in Paris. So that's also it's the Church of Saint Nino, all right, in Paris. And one of their priests was Georgi Peridze, who was killed by the Nazis during the Second World War for protecting Jews. So very interesting sort of people who come out of there. That's the home church and city of the current female Georgian president. So it's a place that I think everyone should go because it's quite different than our experiences. The people are friendly. They like Greeks and they like Americans. Russians, not so much.
We're actually interested.
Yes, that's true. Interesting. That's one way to put it. But Georgia's very interesting and they're very welcoming and accommodating. And it's also not very expensive to travel to Georgia, which makes it even more appealing. Okay, so, next week we will move on and deal with kind of the establishment of the beginning of the Orthodox tradition in Greece, which kind of is simultaneous with the emergence of a culture. So we'll deal with that. We'll move on gradually to the Syro-Methodian tradition right after that. Okay, so unless there are any questions, we have accomplished our purpose tonight, even in much greater depth and length than we thought. Okay,
Very good.
thank you. Have
All credit to you, Bob.
a good evening.
Night, everybody.
Night. We have some chat. Oh, that's it. We're all set.
A very full front seat.